Welcome everyone to Grow Your Own. So today on the channel we are assembling the front wheel hub and putting disc brakes and shocks on the Honda Ruckus. Hope everybody enjoys the video and make sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Share this video with your friends if you like it, and make sure to give us a thumbs up and ring that bell so you get all the newest videos as we post them. If you're new to the channel, be sure to drop me a comment below and I'll be happy to thank you for joining along. And if you've been a long-time subscriber, please drop a comment below and I'll be sure to thank you for all your support. All right, so now that we've got all our parts laid out, it's time to start applying our blue Loctite to all our bolts as we use them to assemble the front hub and attach the disc rotor to the hub. So we want to use our technique of spreading out the Loctite, get everything lined up, and then we're going to install them loosely one at a time and then go back and snug them up real nice and tight. So once you get everything placed, go back and tighten it up. All right, now we're going to test fit our front shock, make sure that they fit with the powder coat. Looks like everything's going to fit, but we do need to loosen these bolts that hold on the lights, the turn signals for this application. Sometimes you'll have a headlight mounted or some kind of other bracket through the triple tree, but you're going to need to loosen those bolts as one of the bolts fits through the groove that's on the top of the shock. So once you test fit everything and see that it's going to fit, we're going to take those bolts back out and apply Loctite and then tighten them back up. So that one fits. Now we're going to try the one on the other side. A quick tip when you're installing these front shocks is the smooth side faces outward. The bump or thick part faces towards the inside where the wheel will go. This is an important step. If not, you may have problems when it comes time to space out your wheel and put your washers and everything in there. You may have to find that one side's tighter than the other, so you want to make sure that you have the correct orientation. Otherwise, things just won't fit the way that they're supposed to, and you'll have problems, and you'll have to take it apart and redo it again. So now that we've got this front shock mounted and we're putting some Loctite on our bolts, we're going to put the bolts back in and then start to tighten everything back down. You can see in this picture we have the shock turned around backwards, and I will have to rotate it 180 degrees when I'm done, once I get everything tightened up at the top. Luckily, the bottom part will spin, and it's not that hard to rotate it. We did have to go ahead and take the light off and get everything lined up so that it would fit properly. But we were able to put it all back together and do it within the time frame before the Loctite started to dry. But you definitely want to use Loctite on these parts and make sure you torque them to the correct specifications so that you don't have any problems later on. Once we got the second one installed, we noticed that they weren't lined up the same. One was up a little bit higher than the other, and so I believe what happened was I had it slid up on the right side a little too high and didn't have my bolt going through that groove like we spoke about earlier. So I went ahead and took the right side completely back apart again. Luckily the Loctite hadn't set, and then just reinstalled everything, made sure I had it in there properly. Rather fix it now than deal with it later when everything else is on and the wheel's on and everything. So just take your time and just make sure you got it right. And go back in, put that bolt in there, make sure it goes through the groove. And then you can finger tighten everything, that way you can test fit, and then go back and use your torque wrench and your socket wrench and make sure everything's nice and tight. You can see we're testing, make sure our wires are long enough for the turn signals and running lights. Everything looks good to go. Big shout out to Visor for coming over and helping me out. He was a lot of help putting this front wheel together. So now we're going to go ahead and put this front axle in and just sort of make sure everything lines up the way that it's supposed to and looks good. Make sure our geometry's right. As you can tell, we still haven't spun that left shock around. We find out here soon that we've got that on backwards, and like I said earlier, you can just spin it around. The old shocks were a little bit different than this, so we didn't have something to look at for an example. So it was a learning process. It took a little bit of time, but in the end we got it all right and got the wheels spaced, and everything turns out really nice. It just takes some time. Be patient. All right, now we're going to go back and tighten everything up now that we've got everything lined up, and everything looks good as far as we know until we go to put the wheel in. But we do have the shocks lined up, and they're at the same height on both the left and right side, so we feel comfortable going ahead and tightening everything down. It's definitely a good idea to just put everything in finger tight and make sure everything lines up before you go back and snug it all down. I had these bolts for the triple tree powder coated to match the prismatic purple, illusion purple, and it made it a little tricky to get the right size socket on since they were a little bit thicker than they would have been from the factory. So that was a little bit tricky, and I was trying to be super careful not to mess up the powder coat when I was tightening them. But it's more important to have them tight and not loose and not have to worry about them than to mess up the powder coat. So if you have any tips on how to powder coat bolts and have them remain in the same tolerance, or if you have any tips on how to tighten bolts that have been powder coated that might be a little bit thick, that would be great. Drop it in the comments. I would love to learn that because I was super hesitant on making these too tight and messing up the powder coat, but I knew that that was the right thing to do. Just make them tight. And off camera we went back and used the torque wrench and made sure everything was tight enough to torque spec. You can also see when you tighten these bolts down, they compress the metal around the front shocks, and you'll see that gap close up. That gap should go to pretty much nothing. There shouldn't be any space there. So now we're going to assemble the wheel and put it on the front hub and use our Loctite. Now that we're a little further along, we feel more confident in that. We're going to put our Loctite on our bolts and spread it around. Make sure you've got your washers on there, and we're going to thread those through. Do them by hand and then go back with the torque wrench or the socket wrench and make sure that everything's good and tight and you don't have to worry about it coming loose. That Loctite is definitely a big recommendation. It's almost mandatory. I would not assemble this Ruckus without Loctite. Anything that I tried to not put Loctite on ended up vibrating loose. So everything gets Loctite. And don't be skimpy with it. Make sure you use enough and coat your bolts. Because this thing, they just vibrate with all the road vibration, the engine vibration, the stiffness of the shocks. You want everything to be good and secure, and you don't want to have to worry about safety problems when you're riding around. So make sure you use your Loctite. I think I've said it 50 times now. Make sure you use your Loctite. Finger tighten everything, and then go back and get it good and tight. I'll definitely recommend picking up a set of T-handle metric Allen wrenches. They came in very, very handy on this build. They're an essential tool in my toolbox for pretty much any import style motorcycle or ATV. They're super handy. They're not very expensive. This set came from Harbor Freight. You know, if you have a set from Snap-on or somebody else, that's probably even better. But an inexpensive set works very well from Harbor Freight, and they are a whole lot easier to use than trying to use a regular, L-shaped Allen wrench, the standard, one that has the 90-degree bend on it. They wouldn't get down in there the way you want it to, and you wouldn't have the ability to put enough leverage on there. So definitely recommend a T-set of those. So now we're trying to figure out the orientation for the mounting of the brake caliper. This was a little tricky again. We didn't really have something to go with. So we finger tightened everything, test fit it, and it was even, difficult trying to figure out exactly which bolts went where. So which side of the caliper it went on for spacing and all that kind of stuff. But we did finally get it, and just took some time. this whole process of putting the front wheel and shocks and disc brakes on took a while, so I didn't get every bit of it recorded, but we've got the bulk of it here, and you'll see a finished product at the end. So a couple tips that we learned as we did this assembly is you want to leave your disc rotor a little bit loose so that you can slide the caliper over the rotor. So you want to only put those bolts for the disc in about basically long enough that they catch and hold the disc rotor on, because we ended up having to go back after we put everything together and loosen those bolts and let that disc be wobbly so that way you can slide the caliper in. This is about the same time that we figured out that that left shock was on backwards, and so we flipped that around. And once we had it flipped around, the spacers all lined up and we were able to space the wheel appropriately. Make sure you put a little bit of axle grease on that front axle so that everything spins very smoothly and doesn't bind.